Okay, welcome everybody. It is nice to see you this Thursday morning to dive into the daf. I've been a little sick and out of work this week, so I'm a little out of the daf this week. And I am really grateful to be here, not just as a facilitator, but as a student this morning. And on that note, we are welcoming a new teacher into the rotation today. This is Rabbi Shira Botzum. She received smicha from Hadar just over a year ago and is a New York City-based Jewish educator, also with a BA and an MA in Talmud and Rabbinics from JTS and Columbia. That's a Columbia List College combo program, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
And also has studied at Pardes, lots of wonderful institutions. And she has spent this past year working as a day school rabbi and also a part-time Hillel rabbi, and somehow has time to come teach for us. And in case you're wondering, she is the sister of a familiar face here, Rabbi Lexi Botzum. So Rabbi Botzum, go ahead and let's get started.
That's great. That's good. I love the most important part of my bio, the last one. But hi everybody. I'm so excited to be here with y'all and do some learning together. So I'm going to do sort of a bit of an overview of where we are and some of the broad topics this week, and then we'll dive into a couple of sugyot. So this past week of Daf Yomi was covering basically like more or less the third parak, the third chapter of Avodah Zarah, which is called Kol HaTzlamim, right? All of the images or statues, right? The previous parak that you guys just finished the week before this, right, sort of focusing on questions of how we interact with idolaters themselves or different non-Jews, right, and how trustworthy or not we think they are, and then a lot about Gentile foods, right? And many of the past couple of weeks were spent on all these questions of foods of non-Jews, their kashrut status, how we can relate to them. So this parak Kol HaTzlamim, right, really starts diving into this big section at the heart of this Masechet, which is about sort of potentially idolatrous objects, right? Like what we might refer to as idols. Right? It's sort of very like classic Avodah Zarah topic that like would come to mind when someone says the term. And this whole parak is really focused on these questions of these objects of idolatry, how to define them, and how to navigate interactions with them, right? This brings up a number of different topics and questions. So I know this past week you started the parak with the first few dapim that were focusing on sort of what counts as an idolatrous object and what kind of knowledge do you need about it, right? Is it sort of a more objective designation, right? Or is it a more subjective definition about how people relate to it, right? We saw that big three-part machloka with Rabbi Meir and Chachamim and Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel about what kinds of statues you need to assume are forbidden to benefit from because of Avodah Zarah, right? So that took up a bunch of that space, right? And the second Mishnah and the material on that moved into sort of the next level, right? Sort of, okay, we have this idea about if you see a statue, but what about broken pieces of statue, right? Are those generally permitted? What about more significant pieces, right? Like a whole foot or something, right? And the Gemara there had a really interesting and lengthy discussion between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish about idols that broke on their own, right? Is the very act of becoming broken, right, significant for an idol, or is it more about you need some kind of like human intention? So this week picks up with the discussion on the third Mishnah in the parak. So with that, we're gonna look at that together and then look at a couple of sugyot. So I'm putting in the chat, I'm also gonna share my screen, But I'm putting a link to the source sheet there. And then we'll also pull it up here. Okay, and I'm just making sure I can share screen. Great. Actually, Rahel, I think, are you able to turn on?
Ah, yes. Okay, hang on. I forgot to make you a co-host when we
Oh, great.
started this.
Okay. Oh no, now it seems
Now you're endowed with all the co-hosting powers.
amazing.
And since you said the word many times, I just wanted to make sure folks on the call know that Perek is a good word to know. It means chapter,
Yes.
right? So we are talking about this new chapter.
Okay. So can everyone see that? Yeah? Okay,
Yes, we can see you.
great. Okay. Amazing. So we are going to start off look at this third Mishnah. And then this really interesting sugya about it involving Rabban Gamliel, very fun character. So the third Mishnah is talking about objects, sort of like objects that are not themselves like a statue, right? But sort of regular objects, kelim, that you might find. Right? So the Mishnah says, Hamotei kelim ve'alehem tzurat chama, tzurat levana, tzurat drakon, yolichem le'yam hamelech, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel omer sha'al hamechubadim, asirin, sha'al hamevuzin, mutarin. Right? So the Mishnah says, if you find these kelim, these vessels, right, and they have one of these three symbols on them, right, either the image of a sun, a moon, or a dragon, you have to throw them into the Dead Sea, which is just a way of saying destroy them, like get rid of them really well, right? Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel makes this distinction between sort of like nice vessels, ones that are respectable, respected, and ones that are not so nice, maybe more mundane every day. We only have to be worried about these images if they are on sort of nicer vessels, that they might be something that is an object of idol worship. Okay, so we have this idea here, right? Just noting that the previous discussion was really all about something that you might think of as a more classic like idol, and that is like a fully 3D, we're imagining like statue. Right, like you see like a statue of a Greek god, or later in this chapter we see of a goddess, right? This whole really interesting story about statue of Aphrodite, right? And this Mishnah sort of talking about something maybe like one level below that, right? Something that is not its own like full 3D object, right? It's something else. It's a ring, it's a plate, right? It's something that has this maybe flat, maybe like slightly raised, we'll see, image of something else, and sort of how concerned do you need to be about that if you just come across it, right? So the Gemara brings in this really interesting story about Rabban Gamliel, different than we said Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, another of our Rabban Gamliels, but also from that generation of the Tanaim, from the early rabbis generation, and it brings the source from the Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah. This Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah is coming in a discussion about the idea of how we set the Jewish calendar, right? Which is done by, it's a lunar calendar, right? It's done by the moon, right? So the moon and what it looks like would be, right, an important part of this process, right? That the way you do this calendar setting, or this Kiddush HaChodesh, so we'll call it, is you have people who are witnesses who have to like report that they have seen the moon in its different phases, right? And testify to this to rabbinic authorities, right? Who can then say, okay, we declare this new month, right? And this is how we set the calendar for the year. So for this process, right, we learn there, it says Tanan Hatam, it's taught in the Mishnah there in Rosh Hashanah, Demut Surot Levanot, Hayalo L'Rabban Gamliel Ba'aliyato. betavla bakotel shabahen mar'eh et hahedyotot ve'omer lahen kazer item o kazer item. Right, so we learned in that Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah that Rabban Gamliel had this diagram, right, of different phases of the moon in his attic. It was on like a nice little poster that hung on the wall. And he would use this to show the, what they call ordinary people, hedyotot, right, sort of word that means, might remind us of some English words, right, but sort of non-educated Jews who are coming as witnesses, right? And because it's like, okay, they have this eyewitness account, but they might not have the expertise about the moon, right? And to say, okay, point to it, right? Like you would a nice visual aid, we know is always good for teaching, right? Say like, did it look like this or did it look like this? Right. So we know this is a thing that Rabban Gamliel had. The Gemara brings us up to ask this question, Umi Shari, right? Is this allowed? Right? What did we just learn in the Mishnah? Right? Anything with the tzura, the figure of a moon, right, is a problem if you find it. And here the Gemara adds sort of anchors this in a verse from the Torah, right? It says, "V'haktiv lo ta'asun iti," right? This pasuk, this verse from the book of Shemot, right, which is, "You shall not make et literally like with me," right? It says gods of silver, gold, right? This is a commandment God giving sort of not making, right, sort of broadly one of our big commandments in the Torah against idolatry. And when it says with me, the Gemara is going to interpret that. Lo ta'asun kidmut shamashai. Sorry. Hamishamshin lifana. Right? Don't make something, we're going to interpret that as figures of something that is like my attendant, my shamash, right? Those who serve before me, God. And what are the things that we imagine are sort of God's like attendants? I'm going to say things that are in the skies, right? In the heavens, right? Different celestial bodies. We know that we're like shamash, right? We use like for on like a menorah on Hanukkah, right? Sort of like the helper candle, right? This is like God's like helpers, attendants. They're imagining that includes like God hanging up sort of in heaven with all of the different heavenly bodies. And that includes things like the moon, right? Rooting this, anchoring this prohibition in having a figure of the moon. Okay, so Rabban Gamliel at this point is in trouble, right? How is he allowed to have this poster with figures of the moon if it's explicitly forbidden in the Mishnah and by this verse, right? So Abaye steps in to defend him. So Abaye first says, Amar Abaye, lo asra Torah, ella shamashin she'afshar la'asot kimotan, right? Abaye limits the scope of this prohibition and says it's only forbidden to have these images that are of the type of God's sort of attendants that one could actually reproduce them realistically, right? So he's going to go into other kinds of objects that are then forbidden because it's sort of like, okay, if I make an image of this, it might lead you to actually create the thing. But if it's an image of something like the moon, we are not worried that someone is going to try and literally recreate the moon because that would be impossible, right? And this, he brings this Breita as a support, right? Kiditanya, lo ya'asa adam bayit tavnit heichal, achsadra tavnit ulam, chatzer tavnit azara, shulchan tavnit shulchan, menorah tavnit menorah, aval hu oseh shel chamesh v'shel shesh v'shel shmona v'shel sheva, lo ya'asa afilu shel sha'ar mine matchut. Right? In this Breita, it's talking about a person is not allowed to make things that are sort of like model images of things in the sanctuary, right, in the temple, right? That you're not allowed to make something that is like too good of a model when you are making your house or your objects in your house, right? Because these things are, right, not Avodah Zarah, but sort of a parallel category of things which are holy, right, in Jewish tradition, but also have this kind of like distance that we require from them that kind of ends up being parallel to the distance we require from idolatrous objects, right? These things, out of respect for them, we're not supposed to come sort of too close to using them in our everyday lives, right? So they're saying you can't make these exact replicas. You can make ones that are kind of like similar. Fine. Okay. I'm gonna actually skip this next one, right? We have another one. You also can't make one even out of wood, not just metal, right? Because at one point, the Hasmoneans, right, made it out of wood, so not even wood, right? Okay, no wooden menorahs in your house. Okay. So we are going to skip ahead a little bit. That goes into a lengthy discussion with Abaye trying to defend Rabban Gamliel from this, saying, okay, you can't make something exactly like the moon, so it's no problem to have a picture of the moon. The Gemara bringing lots of challenges, right? And he gets into this distinction there between, okay, well, what about making versus sort of finding or using, right? And so the Gemara here is picking up on that discussion, right? Saying, is the making of those figures permitted either, right? If you want to say, well, making is different than sort of finding and using, right? It says, again, that same question, Mishari, who permitted this, right? Why, what is your grounds for permitting this? It brings that same pasuk, that same verse from before, lo ta'asuniti, you should not make with me, God, gods of gold or silver, right? And so lo ta'asun kidmut shamashai hashemashim lefanai b'maron kegon chama ulevana kochavim umazalot, right? Again, you cannot make things that are with me in the heavens, right? Any of these things that serve me up on high, the sun, the moon, the stars, different constellations. So at this point, Rabban Gamliel in trouble still, right? Abaye's defense of him here has not worked, right? We've come back to the same thing. It really seems like it's a problem to be making even images of the moon, right? So then the Gemara will propose is like, okay, we'll try a different angle. Let's try and defend Rabban Gamliel in a few different ways. So next they say Shani Rabban Gamliel. Rabban Gamliel is different to Acherim Asula. Okay, so one solution is saying, okay, Rabban Gamliel's case is different because he didn't make the chart, he's just using it, right? And so maybe there is actually only a prohibition of making those things, right? But using them, owning them, not a problem. Okay, we're going to reject that and say, okay, no, but we have this case of Rav Yehuda, and there's a story where he had this seal with a figure on it, and Shmuel said to him, right, his teacher said to him, you have to, or sorry, his student, you have to destroy that thing, right? You have to destroy part of it, right? Because presumably even owning this sort of figure, this seal, this ring with a person's like face on it, is no good, right? So it seems like owning it's still a problem. We can actually maybe skip through this one. They say, okay, maybe it depends if it is like a raised seal versus a like indented seal, right? Going back to that, like how 3D or not is an object, that's going to make it sort of like a more aggravated case. And the flatter it is, or the more sort of like concave, the more mitigated those circumstances will be, right? And then the Gemara asks this really interesting question here, right? It goes, Umi chayshina lachashta. They're like, wait, are we actually worried about like pictures of people, right? Images of people? Because we have this this anecdote, right? It says this shul, this Beit Knesset that was originally in Eretz Yisrael and was destroyed, and then rebuilt in Nehardea in Bavel, right? We know that there is this shul that people go to that has this statue in it, right? Has a statue, has an image, and more even more juicy, right? We know that Shmuel's father and Levi, right, two very respected sages, used to go and daven in that shul, right? So if these really great rabbis would go to this shul that has an image of a person in it, seems like maybe that should actually be fine, right? Maybe the case about the ring is not a good proof that you can't own these objects, right? They answer though and say, no, Rabim Shane, right? It's different when you are in a public space, right? That somehow we're less worried about people sort of like covertly doing Avodah Zarah, covertly doing idol worship of things inappropriately if it's in this public space. But interesting, again, this sort of like theme in this Masechet of, learning a lot of these really interesting like realia of Jewish communities at the time, right? And people bringing up these examples of like, well, don't we know that like there's this shul that has these images in it, right? There are these people who have these idols. We know this bathhouse in our city has these statues in it, right? And sort of learning a little bit about that like material reality, right? And sort of there being like, okay, how do the rabbis navigate that? But back to Rabban Gamliel, right? They say, okay, well, but that doesn't work for him because he is a yachid, he is an individual. So if it's in his house, that's still a problem, right? And then they're going to say, okay, well, Kevan de Nasihu, since he was the Nasi, right, the leader of the rabbinic sort of community at the time, Shlichi Rabim Gave, that he was always sort of with members of the public, right? That his attic was not really a private space; it was really a public space. There were always people there, right? And so we're actually not worried about it, right? V'baitema, they give another solution. Difrakim Havai, that maybe actually the figures weren't whole; that you had lots of little pieces that assembled, and so maybe it's not even like a whole figure. And then lastly, they give what I think is a very fun resolution, right? We see them sort of like throwing everything they have at this because they're like, it has to be okay for Rabban Gamliel to have had this moon chart, right? It is in the Mishnah. We can't have that be a problem, right? Say ve'ivait ema. And if you want, you could also say a different solution, lihit lamed shani, right? That having these figures of the moon is different if it is in order to teach oneself, right? Titania lo tilmad la'asot, right? Like this in this verse that says you should not learn to do like the bad things that the other nations were doing, right? It says aval ata lamed lahavin ulahorot, right? You can't learn about idols, right? It's sort of inserting in order to do idolatry, right? You can't learn about idolatry in order to do it like the other nations, but you can learn about it, right, or teach about it in order to understand, right, for permitted sort of educational purposes. So we've said, okay, actually, like maybe it would have been a problem if you just had a nice poster of the moon, right? But here it's in his house, but it's in this public space, right? He's the Nasi, and also it's for sort of educational purposes that are like totally about Torah, right? That are about, you know, teaching people how to recognize the moon, because even though, right, we say it's forbidden to worship the moon, right? We know from this Mishnah that actually like the moon is a really important thing for Jewish law and for Jewish practice, right? And sort of figuring out how is the way that we're going to relate to this that doesn't sort of cross that line, into something that is problematic, right? But also saying, well, but we have to figure out how to have some relationship to this thing, right? Because actually, like these parts of the natural world are maybe neutral and they're things that can be used for bad, right? For idol worship, but also for good, right? For doing mitzvot, for doing commandments such as setting the new month. I think I will maybe end there. I think we're not going to get into the second topic, so I want to leave time if anyone has any questions, comments.
We do. Thank you so much for that presentation. Laura wants to ask about all these ancient mosaics. I will, in the background, see if I can get a picture of one, right? So, like, for instance, the synagogue in Sipori has these beautiful mosaics of, I think it's like the zodiac, and there's a woman in the middle of one of them, and other things, right? What are we to make of all of this iconography in ancient synagogues?
Yeah, no, that's such a good question. And I think that it really gets to the heart of this sort of uh, as old as time tension between rabbis and the Jews, the Jewish people in general, and that we see even as far as like the earliest sources, that rabbis have a lot of opinions about what Jews should be doing. And Jews sometimes listen to those and follow them, and sometimes they really don't. And the rabbis kind of struggle with like how much control do they actually have over those things, right? We know also in this period in the Talmud specifically, rabbis were sort of even much less powerful in terms of their role in Jewish society than they sort of became at later points, like with the academies in Bavel after the Talmud and in the medieval period. At this point, like rabbis don't actually have that much power, at least hard power. And so one answer is really just that people, had their traditions, had things they liked to do, and it didn't always accord with rabbinic ideas of what was proper. And this tension, particularly in shuls, really has actually continued through to much of the present day. I have actually a really fun story. I remember I was visiting a shul in Mexico City a few years ago, and the tour guide showed us that there were this really beautiful sort of like our own at the front, and it had these like lions on either side of it. Um, and he was like, "Well, this was actually like a very controversial thing." And you see how like that lion is like missing a piece of its ear, which is actually there was this historic synagogue that the Jewish community there was trying to recreate, right? And they were like, "It has these lions on it. Our Aron Kodesh has lions. That's what we've always done." But the rabbis of the shul then started freaking out and were like, you cannot have the lions, you have to remove them. And they came to a compromise. They're like, okay, if you knock off the ear of the lions, then you can keep it, right? And that was even, pretty recently in the last few centuries. So this is sort of a fun tension that really never went away.
Thank you. Julius has his hand up. Julius, I think you should be able to unmute now.
Okay, the question that I have is which Gamliel is this? Gamliel the first or Gamliel the second?
That is a great question. I'm going to be honest, I don't know which number Gamliel this one is. As you're pointing to, there are a number of them. And in this sort of like right rabbinic dynasty that we learned he's the Nasi, right? He's the sort of the head of the rabbinic community. And we have like many Rabban Gamliels. So I don't actually remember which number this is. This is definitely the same one who is talked about, right? Right, we have from Avodah Zarah, from Rosh Hashanah, the one who is like the head of the Sanhedrin there, who is like in charge of how they set the calendar and clearly has a lot of power, is able to force the
Oh,
other
okay.
rabbis to uh, sort of follow his calendar even when they say it's wrong. But it is a good question. I don't remember exactly which number we are on, but I can check that out for you after if you are interested.
Okay.
All right, thank you so much. I think we're going to wrap it there because we have reached the half hour. Thank you, Rabbi Botzum, for joining us today and teaching us today. Thank you to all of you for your comments and questions. It's always a pleasure to learn with you on Thursdays. I'm wishing everybody here a Shabbat Shalom, and we will see you in your inbox tomorrow morning, and we will be back here next week to learn more in this format. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
All right, thank you, everybody.